been talking about objectives, writing objectives for a class. I've given you some samples. We've talked about how to do that. Let's move now from objectives to learning paths. Learning paths. What are possible learning paths? Well, there's some obvious ones. We've got lecturing, we've got question and answer, and we've got group discussion, we've got small group discussions, and we've got visuals of various kinds. We've got reading. People can do readings, make reports, use for children's classes and all. You can use flannel board, whatever. You can use map studies, computers. We have a computer room in our elementary classrooms. Let me tell you about our Journeyland thing. It's kind of interesting. We have 6 rooms for elementary. 6 rooms. Each room is designed for a different kind of learning path. One room is called the map room. They have maps and things about the times and the culture that the Bible story is in. We have a drama room where they act out the story. Sometimes people act it out in front of them, sometimes they're involved in the acting it out. We have a research room where they use books and look up things, that are appropriate to their age. We have a computer room where they sit at a computer and the lesson has been prepared so that they can go through some computer activities involving word studies, studies of scripture, video clips, audio clips, little tests they take, see if they've reached the objectives, and if they haven't, they go back through and do it again, and they can print things out to show what they've learned. And at the computer room, there's a room for handcrafts where they make things that relate to the Bible story they've been studying and so on. So here are different learning paths. My wife does the computer room. She doesn't program it, but she designs the computer program. She designs the lessons. Somebody else does the actual computer programming. But she incorporates video clips and audio clips, and they have a thing that they call, a section they call Learn It, and then they have a section called Quiz It, and they have a section called Review It, and they can go through different things on the computer, and it pats them on the back appropriately when they get it right and all that kind of stuff. So those are different learning paths, Let's talk about learning paths for high school. What are some different ways that you think are effective learning paths for high school students? What would you do? How would you use learning paths for a high school class? What are some things you think would be most effective in high school learning? Inductive, okay. Elaborate on that a little.
Only because we've been talking about it lately, but I think that we just had recently evaluated what our teachers, we have a 7-year-old man teaching the high school on Sunday morning.
Yes.
And it's just not working. He's teaching a book, and every year he goes through the same book. And the elders have decided that's just not working. It's breaking his heart, but but at the same time, I think you need to go in there and you just say, well, what does the passage tell us? How, I'm trying to get more feedback on it.
Let them get involved.
Let them get involved, yeah.
Let them be involved in the learning. That's very important for that age group. One of the ways to do that is to divide them into small discussion groups so that you have round tables and 5 or 6 or whatever sit at a table along with an adult discussion leader, and the maybe somebody introduces the lesson and kind of sets it up, and then you send it to these tables, and they sit around, and the leader leads them in discussion so that they aren't just wandering around, and he asks questions and lets them answer, and they study the scripture and they apply it to their lives and all this stuff in a small discussion setting. Well, that works pretty well. That's pretty good.
So you're saying have a leader for each group?
Yes, a leader for each group. Sometimes it's a couple, a husband and wife team, work with a group.
So that negates the purpose for one that is looking over the class?
Yeah. So you have one who is kind of maybe he starts it off with 10 minutes of introduction to the passage or the issue or whatever, and everybody is, it would be as if we put those 4 tables together and made a small table over here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So you have 4 tables, you have a table, however many students you've got, and so he would start out where they all could hear him, and so he would introduce the class and talk about what is, what sets it up and what's important, and get them sort of attuned to the lesson, and then they turn it over to those in the small groups, and the leaders there have been prepared. I mean, they've learned, they've been taught what to do when it thunders, and so they have learned, what they're supposed to talk about and how they're supposed to lead the discussion, and often those discussion leaders will have some contact with these students outside of the classroom. I mean, they become kind of mom and daddy, a little bit. Sometimes they go with them to places, and they, so it's a kind of develop a relationship with a small group they've got.
How do you do that when you're, I'm sorry, I know you're talking about your congregation in particular, but when you're a smaller congregation, how are you going to get 6 teachers in a high school?
Well, I don't know, but there should be, let us suppose you've got 15 in your high school group, and you have 2 groups.
I'll just do 2 groups. Okay.
And so you'd have however many groups, you need, and then hopefully you'd be able to find enough teachers to lead in that discussion.
Yeah.
So you can have, 5 or 6 or 8 or something, a group of that size, depending on how you can divide it up. Robert Oglesby is kind of the granddaddy of this method. He's down at Waterview in Richardson, Texas. Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. We've been down the road together a few times, and but he's very strong on this, and he has developed a set of books, I guess on every New Testament book and maybe some Old Testament books, in which he has discussion guides that tell you, if you're going to study 1 Corinthians 7, what questions should you ask in order to provoke discussion? And they're pretty good. He has this principle about group discussion that's kind of interesting. He says, if you're going to study a passage by group discussion, you don't start with the question that comes first in the text. You start with the question that is the most important one in that text. So if the only one you ever get to, if they get to discussing and that's the only one they get to, they got to the one that was most important. It's kind of an interesting theory. But anyway, that would be a way of teaching high school that does what you say, gets them involved, doesn't just announce to them all the conclusions and say, okay, that's it, but lets them talk about it and apply it and see it in their own set of circumstances. And so that's one learning. See, what are we talking about? Learning path. See, that's a learning path. That's learning path using small group discussion.
I learned that sometimes they enjoy getting treated like younger kids.
Mm-hmm.
We try to make them grow up so fast and they have to sit and be quiet. Yeah. Instead, if you treat them like a younger kid and you give rewards and things,
sure.
They want candy just as much as a 3rd grader wants candy, or whatever.
Yeah, motivation is pretty important, and there's various kinds of motivation. Sometimes you motivate high school kids by you're going to have a campaign, you're going to have some kind of a campaign or event that they want to go on, and they can't do it until they've memorized certain scriptures or whatever it is, you know, and so they're motivated to do it because they can't go unless they do. So that's methods for high school. You can have, in high school classes, you certainly would use visual aids. They're tuned into that. So you'd want to use visual aids. Letting them participate in various ways, not only discussion, but even if you're lecturing, use question and answers to do things that are going to let them be involved. Would be very important. You'd want to choose subjects, your subject matter, in such a way that it relates to them and deals with their needs and also with things that they can connect with. What other things do you think of about teaching high school? What methods would work best?
Movement.
Giving them a chance to move around.
That could be the last one.
Not keeping them tied down to one spot, but some things that give them a chance to move a little bit.
I know it sounds dumb, but just when I was a teen, our favorite time was like once a month when the teachers would let us just sit outside on the grass during class.
Okay.
I know it makes no sense, but just something different.
Sure. Okay. Well, sometimes there are teaching methods that let people move from place to place. This is usually used in smaller groups, in younger groups, but you can have teaching stations. And let's suppose that back in that corner we have a table and it has certain things to do when you go there. And over here you have certain other things to do. Over here you have other things to do. And you let them move from station to station. That can work for preschool, elementary, even up into probably some high school levels. And the things you do may relate to map study, may relate to some kind of, could be a little thing you do on the computer when you go to that spot. It could be something that is related to some sort of visuals that you use.
Maybe the 7 churches and you have them go to each one.
Yeah, exactly, sure. Or they can look up something in a reference book or what, you know, so there are things they can do at different stations. Sometimes they are, especially for elementary, they can be more game-like oriented, you know, some kind of a game thing you do when you go from place to place. So learning stations can be helpful with children and up into high school probably. An excellent way for high school to learn is to get them involved in teaching somebody else. Let them do a puppet show for the kids, the younger kids. Well, okay. They got to learn something. They got to write the script. They got to do something to learn for the younger kids. That can be a way in which they can present. They can write a play that tells the story, and then they have to act out the play and do the costuming and whatever. So they're involved and they're presenting it to somebody else. Can be a good learning path for high school. You think of some other things, high school learning paths. Well, let's go to adult classes. You started talking about this a while ago, but let's elaborate on some. What things that we have done in this class do you think would be good learning paths for an adult class?
Laptops? No, I'm just kidding. I would probably say a lot of material that you hand out.
Handouts.
I think that's helpful.
Handouts can be useful for adult classes, things that either they complete, they fill in the rest of it, or taking notes, or just something that gives them a little guide to what you're talking about. Handouts can be very good for adult classes, yeah.
Visuals.
Say again?
Visuals.
Visuals. Chalkboard, a marker board, PowerPoint, especially if you're studying something that gives you a chance to talk about, when you're talking about Ephesus, to show pictures of Ephesus. then and now and things like that that are available. I mean, the ruins in Ephesus are wonderful. I mean, the amphitheater where they shouted, "Great is Zion of the Ephesians" for 2 hours is still there. You can go there and sit there for 2 hours and shout, "Great is Zion of the Ephesians" if you want to, I guess. But those places are there. Show them those places. So use of visuals with adult classes can be helpful.
Well, you notice, I've never seen it before in a class, but I guess it's just because we're so great as students. We all sit on the front row.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that makes it really tough in the auditorium when you're at the very front and they're at the very back.
That's right. I know it. That's a hard one to overcome.
They did well last night by just cutting it off halfway in the middle with the podium.
Set the podium halfway back.
That was a good idea.
You may have to do that sometimes. Yeah, where people sit makes a difference. That's a good observation. Sure. What else that we've done in here do you think would have application to an adult class?
You lecture to us?
Lecture, and presentation of certain material, and then letting you discuss it, talk about it. Letting you, I try to find different ways of letting you use your Bibles. You know, somebody read a passage for the class. We're digging this passage, and now you look at, and I ask you a question. Okay, dig this out of the passage and take a few minutes, and then come back with your answers.
I have a very pertinent question regarding this discussion, especially if you're having a discussion in an adult class. Supposing you throw out some discussion questions, are women allowed to get involved in that? Can they?
Well, I think, different churches would handle that differently, perhaps. I think in the class setting, which is outside of the regular assembly, there is some flexibility that you would not have in the assembly. I don't think it's appropriate for a woman to lead prayer or teach the class, but I think that she may participate from her seat and not be taking over leadership of the class. And see, I guess my point on this is, this has come up 2 or 3 times. Let me give you my sermon on women, okay? Here are the main points of my sermon about women. All right?
Write them down.
Write these down. This will not be on the test, okay? Point 1 is that men and women have equal standing before God. There's neither male nor female, okay? They have equal standing before God. Number 2, that God has designated men to have certain roles of spiritual leadership. God has designated men to have certain roles of spiritual leadership. Who offered the sacrifices in the Old Testament? Always the men. Okay. Who were the apostles? All men. Who does all the public preaching in the Bible, in the New Testament? It's all men. Paul says that there are, in 1 Corinthians 11, that the order of leadership is God, Christ, man, woman. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14, as also says the law, women to keep silent. So God has given certain roles of leadership to men as opposed to women. Number 3, God's reasons for designating men for those roles are lasting reasons and not cultural. When Paul says that talks about this matter in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, because man was first formed and then woman. Is that still true?
Yes.
Because woman came from man. Is that still true? Yes. Was that a cultural thing? No. The reasons he gives are, and in the passage in Timothy it says, because woman sinned first. Is that still true? Yes. So the reasons given are not cultural reasons.
Did you say women's?
Eve sinned before Adam.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reasons given in these passages for God having given men the leadership roles are not based on culture. It's based on things that are just as true today as they were then. So that was number 3. Number 4, God has made applications of the male spiritual leadership principle. God's made applications. He says men are to be the elders. He says men are to be the spiritual leaders in the home. He says men are to lead the worship. These are God's applications of the principle of male spiritual leadership. That's number 4. Number 5, God has left to us making the application of this principle in circumstances he did not specifically mention.
God has left to us application?
God has left to us making the application of this principle to situations he didn't mention. He didn't mention Bible classes. He didn't mention home Bible studies. He didn't mention writing articles for papers. He didn't mention some of these things, okay? So, in those situations, we have to decide what is true to the principle that is as true to the principle as we can make it. And in our fellowship, we have decided that it is faithful to that principle for a woman to engage in discussion in a Bible class as long as she doesn't take over the Bible class. It's okay for her to make a comment or read a scripture as a participant in the class, but not as a leader of the class. That's our attempt to apply the principle to a situation God did not specifically tell us about. Now we've got to be sure that, as you said a while ago, that in making this application, we don't undermine the principle. See, that's where we get in trouble. Yes, we start letting women do things in class, like leading prayers where men are present and other stuff, and before long that becomes part of the service. So I think we try to do it in a way that allows women the freedom that God would seem to allow, but not undermine the principle. But God didn't speak to some of these situations. We just have to make the best application we can. That's back to your question. See, here's a Bible class, and God didn't tell. Well, here's exactly how you apply this in a Bible class. So we make the best judgment we can.
Brother, now, the reason why I've been bringing this up so regularly
Sure.
during this thing is because, look, what you're teaching, I strongly believe in.
Sure, I understand.
But we've been having problems in the congregation that I preach for.
Okay, sure.
Where these liberal women who are
Yes.
influenced by Pepperdine.
I understand.
And the previous eldership allowed this woman to lead a prayer once.
Yeah, okay.
And now since we have 2 more newer conservative elders
Yes.
who asked me to come preach there,
Right.
we've made tremendous inroads
Yes,
in
yes.
stopping all the activities.
That's right. Okay.
She used to separate the children during worship time.
Yes.
And she used to teach them. She separates the women on Wednesday nights.
Mm-hmm.
She's a treasurer, and she's on the board of trustees,
Yeah.
and she's got lots of positions. Yeah, and so we're trying,
Sure.
of course, biblically speaking, to try to just bring
That's right.
activities to a minimum.
Okay. So that was number 5. Number 6 and last is God has given wonderful roles for women to fill. I guarantee you, when I'm sitting in the elders meeting many times, what my wife is doing while I'm in the elders meeting is a lot more important than what I'm doing in the elders meeting, okay? I've been an elder since 1972, so I've sat in lots of elders meetings. And so her work is no less important than mine, I guarantee you. Now, yes, I get up and do the preaching, but she does lots of stuff that's equally or more important. And so for women to say, well, if I can't preach, then I'm unimportant is absolutely a mistake.
What's your response on that sermon? Do you get a lot of good response from it?
Yeah, pretty good. And that's what I preach. That's what
good.
It's what I teach. What I teach in Bible classes, whatever.
I had a woman the other day tell me, well, I don't have time to teach. We were talking with the campaign and stuff. She said, I don't have time to teach, and I don't have time to do this, and I don't have time to do that. It was someone who was wanting to be baptized. And she said, would your church still want me? And I said, the most important job for you to do is raise your children, correct?
Of course. Of course. Of course. Okay, well, which leads me to say something about teaching methods, all right? From what I just gave you, what do you learn from that about how to teach?
It takes work.
Okay, yeah, it does.
I mean, not just that, but
Planning.
To get it capsuled.
Yeah, you can't just decide on Saturday night, this is what I'm going to do.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think it shows that you need to put things in something that's easily comprehended. Easily comprehended. So when you teach, you need to be sure that you have digested it in a way that people can easily grasp it and not just float around here and there and whatever. Okay, we're still talking about learning paths. For adults, we've talked about question and answer, group discussion, dividing them into small groups, you can do that, use of visuals, letting them do some things in the teaching, letting them. We're doing a thing that's kind of interesting right now. During the summer, we have different men in the class teach for one Sunday. That's got its good and bad. Some of them are not very good teachers. And so the class has to suffer through that. On the other hand, it's a pretty good training ground for these men to be able to teach class and to have the experience of teaching, and maybe in the process we find some people that weren't teaching that now can become teachers. And so letting people take on some responsibility for teaching that maybe haven't been doing it as a way of learning and developing them might be useful. What else would you say about adult teaching, learning paths for adults? Have you seen something done that you want to mention that we haven't talked about?
I think to grasp their attention.
Yeah, you surely need to hold their attention. And often that's not done very well.
You don't need to make them sit through a sermon Sunday morning Bible class right before they sit through a sermon.
Yeah, that's right. So they really need a little more activity.
I think you could spend a few $100s and bring in a guest speaker for your class.
Okay. Have some special speakers. Can be a good thing. That's a good one.
You want to come next week?
Here's something that we did a while back at our church that was, I'm sorry, what did you say?
I said, do you want to come next week?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Here's something we did that really went over well. The preacher at our church asked me on Sunday, would I join him in the pulpit for two Sunday nights to do a dialogue lesson. It was on last things, in which I have written some books and things, so he thought I was kind of somebody that would be prepared to do that. And so he would ask me questions, and I would answer in front of the whole congregation. And I'd ask him questions. I mean, we had kind of a little dialogue. And so sometimes you might try dialogue teaching, have two people teach the class in which they would interact with each other. And it creates a little difference, a little different dynamic, a little different, more interest.
More preparation.
Yeah, a little more preparation, but you have let them discuss with each other a little bit. Let them ask each other questions. Let them spar with each other a little bit, you know. And that works. Might be useful.
Something just sparked my mind.
Okay.
What happens if you have two teachers at the same time?
Yeah.
One talks about, but of course, be united in the subject that you talk about.
You have to have an interpreter.
Yeah. Okay. You guys.
Oh, he was talking about throwing around money. I know y'all are from big churches that can throw around money. but we couldn't afford it. But Free Hardeman's had a guy that's came up every year to lectureships. You know, they set up booths and sell things. If I had a church that could afford it for the adult class, it's an amazing deal. It is a little receiver that receives all the remote controls with an A, B, C, D on each remote control. And so you can have, you can be teaching through your lesson, you can say, now what's the answer to this? And everybody clicks in their answer, and then it will pop up what the real answer was and how many people got right. So that's something that would really work if you had the
Like
money
a quiz
to.
bowl thing.
Yeah, it's like Quiz Bowl for adults, but it's like, I think, 10,000 or something. So
Oh, that's nothing.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a little response system. Sure. Well, you know, you can do that a lot less money to give everybody 4 cards, A, B, C, D, and let them hold on.
That's true.
You know, so I mean, it wouldn't be quite as sophisticated, but you could do that and get responses from
Good idea.
Yeah, that is a good idea.
Here's 2 or 3 other things that you might try in adult classes. If you've got some passages to be read, have a card in which you write the location for that passage and hand them out to people in class so they can be prepared to read that scripture when you come to it. And that gets them involved a little bit and takes the focus off of you as the teacher and spreads it around a little bit. Now, if you really want to be interesting, give them those scriptures and tell them, I'm not going to tell you when to read them. You read them when you think it fits in.
Wow. That's pretty good.
And that'll get sometimes they'll bring it up when you thought, and sometimes they won't, but that's okay. But boy, are they listening, because they got to know when to bring it up. So that can be a way of getting people involved a little bit. There are some workbooks that are used for adult classes that might be okay. I've got some out on Revelation and other things, which in fact, some of these things on e-Bible study have worksheets for students to fill out while they're listening.
Questions.
And then you come back, and then a little quiz for them to answer the next time. So having a little using workbooks. You used to do a lot of that in Bible classes. They don't use much of that anymore. But some of these on e-Bible study, you've got that set up, and you can use those if you want to. That stuff on e-Bible study, you just download and print for nothing and make your copies, and it's available, no charge.
Can you change that too, or is it?
Well, we ask that you not change it and distribute it.
Okay.
If you wanted to change it for your own use, well, that would be okay, but that you not change it and distribute it or something like that. Well, okay, we've talked about adult classes and possibilities here for adult classes on learning paths. Now let's talk a little bit about evaluation. Evaluation. One of the primary reasons that adult classes and high school classes don't learn any more than they do is because there's no opportunity for them to show what they've learned. I'm giving you this week some opportunities to show what you've learned. I think you learn more because you're going to have those opportunities. You're going to have a test, you're going to have a sermon tomorrow to give, things like that. If I were at Oklahoma Christian, if I went into class and said, here's a great book I want you to read for this class, I will have to tell you, we will not have a test over it. I will never mention it again. I just hope you'll go out and read it. Now, how many are going to go read it? Well, not many. They've got other stuff to do. So one of the main reasons our classes don't learn anymore is because they're never given enough. They're never told they're expected to learn, and they're never told that any kind of check is going to be done as to whether they have learned anything or not. We just don't set up the experience to have very good learning. So how can you evaluate? Well, we talked before about having a quiz available at the beginning of a class that people can pick up if they want to participate. That's one way to do it. Some of the stuff on e-Bible study that I mentioned have got quizzes like that to hand out at the next class meeting. You can evaluate by asking questions. So you say, before we start the lesson today, let's review last week's lesson a little bit. We talked about this. You call on somebody or ask if anybody can answer something about last week's lesson and try to milk them a little bit to see who can remember what with an oral quiz. That's one way to do it. Another way to evaluate adult classes is in things that they're going to do as a group. You've taught them some things about, I'm working right now, for example, on some lessons on personal evangelism. And we're going to study one day in that class conversational evangelism. That is, encouraging people to talk to people about the church in their regular conversations. So they're having a conversation with somebody standing in line at the grocery store, and they say, something really interesting happened at church yesterday. Okay. Or some teenager is sitting at lunch with his friend and says, our youth group is doing something really interesting. Next week we're going to go somewhere. Or somebody is, I mentioned to you the other day the example of the mechanic in the cafe or the woman in the beauty parlor. So you study about conversational evangelism. Now you say, okay, next week at the start of class, I'm going to ask you to tell me about the conversational evangelism you did this week. So next week, class comes and you say, okay, Tom, did you do any? Mary, did you do any? Or are you asking me? Who did something you want to share with us? And you may or may not get any, but you keep after it until you do. And so you do evaluation by asking them, how did you apply what we studied last week or the week before in your daily living? That's really where it counts the most, isn't it? It's not, remember, making a list of something. It is, did you apply it to daily life? And so you can talk about some issue of husbands and wives or whatever it is, and then ask, what'd you do last week that connects with what we've been studying about? So that's a way to evaluate. And so that can be a useful means of evaluation for adult or high school classes is tell us what you did last week that we've been studying about. You could, at the end of a class, give a quiz of some sort, asking people to share what they have remembered and learned about that class. Telling them we want to see if this class has been effective, and if you have any suggestions about how it could be done better or whatever, and give them a chance to respond. So evaluation is important. Better evaluation is probably done at the elementary and preschool level than at the high school and adult level, where they do lots of things that evaluate. You know, you're going to get a gold star if you can say this memory verse. Well, that's evaluation. If you bring somebody with you to class next time, well, you're going to get X, and so if they bring somebody, they get something. They work on some kind of a drawing in class, and they get to take it home and show their parents, and that's evaluation sometimes. And the teacher says, okay, you have to take this home and explain it to your parents and have them sign that you told them about it, and you bring it back next week. And so the kid goes home and tells his parents about what he learned, and then brings it back next week. Well, all these are ways of evaluating. And it's really important that people have a chance to be evaluated and to see how they're doing. That's an integral part of the learning process. So don't forget to do to build into your system some kind of evaluation. You really need evaluation. We've got down here systems evaluation.
Let me ask you a question real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
As you mentioned in your adult Bible class that y'all started there, we do something similar to that where I am on Sunday mornings. When you have multiple teachers, how would you do evaluations?
Well, explain that a little bit more.
Like, ours is not exactly like yours. Ours, one teacher will take the first Sunday, the next one, the second Sunday, next, third, next, fourth, and then it repeats every month.
Four different teachers?
4 different teachers. Okay. So, how do I evaluate what the teacher before me did?
Okay. You mean by way of review or something at the beginning of the class? Well,
what'd y'all do last week?
You could ask that teacher to provide you some questions to ask the class. And put all the blame on him. So you wouldn't be in the class, you'd be somewhere else teaching probably, and then you teach this Sunday. So
most other teachers will be there every time.
Okay, well, if they've been there, then they might do it, but it would be okay to have the teacher. I think it'd be really good to have the teacher to do that, because it would, if he knew you were going to ask that next week, he'd probably teach better, because he knew the question was going to be asked. See, that's how all this ties together. I hope you're seeing that. Systems evaluation means that you find out some things about how the whole thing works. Maybe at the end of class you ask the students, would you write down a paragraph about what you thought about this class? What you thought was good about it, what you thought might have been better? It's a little dangerous. You might learn some things that'd be helpful.
Lewis was telling me this, so I'm sure you might have heard it too, but somebody that passed out a questionnaire about what people thought about his sermons in the congregation. Supposedly he didn't get a really good review, and I think he quit after that.
Quit after that, yeah, you got to be careful. But it would be, we really need to do some evaluation and find out what's going on. That may be done by somebody sitting in on the class who is expert enough to analyze what's happening. Another way to do that is to have a teacher training program periodically, and have somebody come in and explain about things, and maybe ask the class for feedback and say, well, how do you think it's going? What do you think could be better? How do you think our program could be improved? And that would be some systems evaluation. Obviously, if your feedback on Sunday morning of the previous class shows that nobody's learning anything, that also becomes systems evaluation then. So you need to utilize these sources to find out how it's going. Now, I want to mention another matter that is really critical in all of teaching, and that is application. We talked about this in our preaching. It's also very important in teaching. Most of our classes, especially adult classes, do not do a good job of application. Now, let's see if we can illustrate this. Let's suppose that we've been studying. Let's suppose that we've been studying about telling the truth. And I say to you as a class, okay, tell me how we can apply this in our daily lives. How would you respond?
Not cheat on my taxes.
Not cheat on my taxes, okay. And that's a pretty specific one. But let's probe that a little more.
Not cheat.
Well, how might you be tempted to cheat on your taxes?
Make exemptions.
Time out. You see what I'm doing?
Yeah.
See, you get the point, don't you? How might you cheat on your taxes?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
Make exemptions that aren't real.
Okay. By doing what?
By saying that I spent it on one thing when I really spent it on another.
Now you see what we're doing? See, now we're getting down where the rubber meets the road. What usually happens when you say, let's make application. And a very good technique is to let the class make their own application. You tell them, so, okay, what's this going to mean in our everyday lives? Okay. And it's own honesty, and they say, well, I ought to be honest in my business. And what are you going to say next?
Why?
Why? Why do you need to be honest in your business? Or when are you tempted not to be honest in your business?
I think that's one of the things I do a lot of. I ask, they'll even answer, and I'll say, why again?
Okay, yeah. So when are you tempted to be dishonest in your business? Well, when I'm selling a product. What product? Mm-hmm. How are you tempted to misrepresent it? You know, I mean, just keep pushing until you get somebody really down, like he said, to, well, I call it one thing and it really was something else, see? Or I'm tempted not to report certain income, or, you know, whatever is the specific thing. So you want to keep it tied down to make the application as specific as you can. In a class, you have to really push them to get them to do that. They won't do that at first. But the good applications are going to come when they've been pushed to do it. That's when they're going to get down to where they live. So they're going to say, well, in the home, we ought to be honest in the home. You mean between husbands and wives? Yes. How are wives dishonest with their husbands? I mean, just keep pushing until you get it right down to the specific stuff. Now, what happens typically in Bible class is this. The teacher has every intention of giving some time to application. He's going to do it after they study the lesson out of the text. And the bell rings, and he never, oh, I'm sorry, we never got to the application. So you got to plan it. You either got to plan to do a little bit and then application, a little more application, a little more application, or you got to somehow be sure you leave time at the end. Because if people don't get an opportunity to make application, they really don't. I mean, that's what the objective is. The objective is not that the student can repeat that you should tell the truth. The objective is that when he is faced with a situation in life that gives him the temptation to lie, he will tell the truth. That's what we're trying to get down to. So you need to be sure that proper time is left, proper time in the class is given to application. And there's a great tendency not to do that. So as you're planning your classes, as you're helping people to be teachers, you need to really work hard at getting them to make application. It's crucial. And without that, the class is kind of left hanging. It doesn't get to where it needs to be. Was Jesus pretty specific about application?
Yeah, really.
He sure was. And we need to follow that example. We need to be specific in our application. Man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. You know, and he tells this story. And then he says, now, which man was the neighbor? See how specific that is? The guy that took care of him, the guy that put him on his donkey and took him into the inn and paid the money. And I mean, here's very specific. And we need to help people to be very specific in their applications. So, don't forget to build applications into your lesson. Very important that you do that. Now, I want to give you a sample lesson plan. We'll talk about this a little bit. Well, let's see. Didn't pick up enough. This one comes out of E-Bible studied out of our 1 Corinthians. And I developed these lessons out of 1 Corinthians, not chapter by chapter. I took topics. Here's the topic of worship, which 1 Corinthians talks about in chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 14, and whatever, you know, it's spread in several places. And I pulled that together and talked about the subject of worship as taught in 1 Corinthians. Okay, now, here are so, you know, I wouldn't say, I don't make a lesson plan that's this complete for every Bible class I teach at church, okay, I understand that. But here's the way to think about it and to include as much of this as you can. The first section is background information for the teacher. The objectives. The student can explain what Paul teaches about how to observe the Lord's Supper. The student can relate love to worship. The student can list 4 principles about worship we may derive from 1 Corinthians 14. The student will determine to make his or her worship to God more effective. Okay, do those fit the criteria? Those things the student will do. The student will, the student will, the student can, okay? Then here are things I want to be sure to get ready. Each student must have a Bible, copy of the worksheet and pencil and pen, have ready a board on which to write keywords and ideas, have verses to read ready to hand out before class, have a copy of some songs, a song for everybody to sing, have the review quiz over lesson 3 ready to distribute at the first of the class or as people enter. Then the theme, Paul's corrections of a number of errors in Corinthian worship can help us to be more effective in our worship. That's the theme of the lesson. Now all of that is stuff for the teacher. That's background for the teacher to think about. Now here's a lesson plan for conducting the class. You're going to call the roll, introduce visitors, make the necessary announcements, some songs to sing, give answers to the review quiz. So you notice it says about 10 minutes. So some classes spend 30 minutes on the introduction, see? Well, I'm trying to encourage them not to do that. To get, to spend a minimal amount on this introductory stuff. Then come learning experiences. This is set up basically on a question and answer format. And I'm providing the prospective teacher who's looking at this with questions to ask as a means of conducting the class. So I'm asking him, in effect, do question and answer approach. Okay, read 1 Corinthians 10, 16 to 22. Question, what's the central point of Paul's argument here? And the answer, which hopefully the student is going to give, but I give it here for the teacher's purpose. Question, from what to a non-Christian situation does it illustrate the point? Judaism and idolatry, and so on. So you go through these questions. And then then, number 2, you read 1 Corinthians 11, 17, 34, and here are questions to ask about that. And number 4, what warning does Paul give about taking the Lord's Supper, and so on. So here are questions. Number 5, on the space provided on your worksheet, write what you would like to be your thoughts the next time you take the Lord's Supper. What happened right there?
Where's that?
That's application, see? We put some application right there in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
Number 5.
Which worksheet is it referencing?
Well, at the back, I don't think the worksheet is on here.
Okay.
There is I didn't print out the worksheet. But
Is that provided on the website?
It's provided on the website,
Okay.
and so that the student would all have it. I didn't print one out. Now read the next passage, 1 Corinthians 14:26. Somebody's been given a card with that on it, so he reads it. What principles does Paul teach here about Christian worship? And then you have some questions and answers about that. Number 7, read 1 Corinthians 14, 13, 17. What principle does Paul use here? And then Ephesians 5:19, what does Paul teach here about how to sing, and so on. Now here's the application part. Get your song sheet with have that on the way on it. As I read the words of the song, think about their meaning and get ready to sing them. Okay? We don't do enough of that, of teaching people how to think about what the songs mean. In this song, you're pledging to God before your brothers and sisters. You want God to have His way in your life. You're going to read the words. Sing the song slowly and quietly. Give them a little practice in doing what we've just learned about. Now we're going to practice it. Number 2, what could this congregation do to help us worship more with our spirits and our minds? See the application? How could we as a congregation do better at this? Okay. Change song leaders. Okay. Get rid of the elders. You never know what they're going to bring up. Okay?
Build a new building.
Build a new building. But maybe they say, well, we could study more of the songs we sing. Or we could have a lesson on from the pulpit on what is worship or whatever. Number 3, an easy way to remember the purposes of worship is to think of the word pace. Proclaim, adore, communicate, and edify. These are 4 key words to worship. Paul says, when you take the Lord's Supper, you proclaim the Lord's death till He comes again. Hebrews 13:15, I believe, talks about how we praise God with our lips. Ephesians 5:19 says, make Him better in your heart to the Lord. We're communicating with God. And we edify, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 14, let all things be done to edification. So, how does worship connect with love? See, all this is application part. Worship is an expression of our love for God. As we edify each other, showing our love for one another. So, whatever. Then, the next part is assignment. Use your worksheet for the review quiz. Here are passages to read for next week's lesson. Now, notice the sections of this. The first part is background information from the teacher that includes the objectives, what he has to do to get ready, the things he has to have ready to hand out, and so on, and the theme that he wants to keep in mind. You've got the lesson plan for conducting the class divided into these parts: introduction, learning experience, application, and assignment. Well, that's not the only way to do a lesson plan, but it's a pretty good structure to build around. Okay?
I just compare this, my bachelor's is in education and also construction, but if you look at it this way, it compares to the teaching what I learned in my degree. This was, they'd spend half of your bachelor's on just lesson plans.
That's right.
So this is, but my problem is not with this material. It's with the people that you would like to do this. I see them saying, well, or I've done this for years, so I don't, why would I want to change what I've done for the last 50 years? And I think, and then on and also with that, I don't have time to pray this way.
Sure.
And maybe that would be an eldership.
Well, it probably is. But
Issue.
look, start it easy.
Mm-hmm.
Do a little workshop, maybe hand out a sample one, and ask them to do one for one class, just one class period.
That's good.
And let's see how that, and see what we learn from that.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
And maybe they'll say, that was pretty good. That was pretty helpful. I'll tell you something we do at Memorial Row that I think has been good. All of our adult classes study the same subject on Sunday morning. They're all studying Hebrews. They're all studying whatever, And we have somebody who prepares the lesson outline for those teachers. On Wednesday nights, during our Wednesday night classes, one of the classes is Sunday morning teachers meet together and study together what they're going to study the next Sunday morning. That's been a really good thing. That's been a really good thing.
Wow.
Because
say that again on Sunday morning. On
Sunday morning, they all study the same. All the adult classes study the same subject. And somebody who is who is especially qualified prepares basically prepares a lesson plan like this. Now, it doesn't follow this format, but it's a lesson plan. And then on Wednesday night, prior to that Sunday when they're going to teach it, they all meet and have a Bible class to study the Sunday morning lesson. So they've studied the lesson. Hopefully that's not all their preparation, but it's pretty important. And the one who designed the lesson gets to tell them, well, here's why we did this.
Was that your idea?
No.
That's great.
But it's good. And when I teach it.
Is that just for adults, or are you teaching all the way down to elementary?
Well, this is just for adults.
Okay.
The adults study the same thing, but high school has some different. But one of the when I teach that class, Wednesday night class, as much as I can, I try to teach the lesson like I want them to teach it. Some of them get in there and just talk about it, but I actually try to teach the lesson just like I want them to teach it, and get class discussion like I want them to get it. So I kind of demonstrate how to teach the lesson when I teach that class, and so I think it's a good way to get people ready, and they don't have to follow the lesson plan 100%. I mean, they can make some adaptations if they want to, but it's a pretty good way to get it done. So we have quite a few adult classes, and they all study the same thing on Sunday morning. That has disadvantages. Our singles classes probably need sometimes different things to study than our old people do, and we make some allowances for that, especially on Wednesday night and other things. But
do they do that on Wednesday nights while y'all are in that class? Teach the subjects or whatever?
No, this is for the Sunday morning class, and the Wednesday night class is to prepare them for Sunday morning.
I'm talking about like your young marrieds.
Okay.
What are they doing while you're in the class?
Well, on Wednesday night we have classes that are not divided the same way the Sunday morning classes are. We have different topics.
Okay.
So people can go to, they're mixed age, and they go to whatever one they want on the Wednesday night.
Do you think this would work if we only have one adult class.
Okay.
Do you think this would work if you did junior high school, adult, the same subject?
It might.
Just for the Sunday morning and then Wednesday night,
yes.
a different subject?
My guess is that would work for a quarter. or 2 quarters, but it wouldn't work all the time because there needs to be some, the teenagers need some things that probably are not the same all the time as the adults, but for a quarter or 2 quarters it might work. If you did that, you'd have to have somebody to teach the Wednesday night class that would know how to deal with adaptations for different age groups, that you're not going to teach them all exactly alike. And so you need to have a way of adjusting for the different age groups that would be represented there. But they could certainly, in fact, we have sometimes included teenagers in these topics, but that's not the typical thing. But some thought, I guess my point is some thought about lesson planning, developing a plan for each lesson in some fashion, focusing on what are we trying to do, what are the objectives, and then I think there's a page left out. At the bottom of this, write, after assignment, write the word evaluation. It should, on here, there should be the word evaluation. How are you going to evaluate the people over what they did? So at the bottom of, somewhere after the page, well, write evaluation, that should be one of the, so you've got introduction, learning experiences, application, assignment, and evaluation should be the headings there. And so you consider what are we going to do to let people show they've learned something? Now, what questions have you got about teaching Bible classes? Now, we've been dealing with different things related to that. Do you have some questions about that you want to ask?
One of my struggles is I teach young married class, about 30 people, and every Sunday morning the only problem that exists is young marrieds today are different from the old days. But anyway, I have to call them, some of them every week, to remind them, come to class. Mm-hmm. And they don't realize the importance of being there and what it does for the group. But we provide activities for the young married. We're trying to get them all involved. Mm-hmm. But one of our main problems is the tardiness, the 10, 15 minutes late. How do you address that?
Well,
you can't jump down their throats because they're there.
No.
But
well, there's 2 or 3 things that I would do on that. One is we would have a fixed time to start class. Mm-hmm. We wouldn't start class when everybody shows up.
You wouldn't do it?
We'd have a fixed time to start class. In other words, if you say Bible class is at 10 o'clock, and we're going to allow 10 minutes for people to fellowship and whatever, and 10 till 10 every Sunday, we're going to start the class. And they'll begin to catch on to that and be there by 10:10, if that's whatever time you said to start the class. So I would, if you wait and say, well, John's not here yet, let's wait a few more minutes, then you're going to wait forever. So I would have a fixed time to start the class and start the class at that time. Then on getting them there, obviously calling them and knowing who's there and encouraging is a good thing to do. One of the best things to build spirit in a class is for them to work on a joint project together. Let them a service project. In other words, they're going to go out and work in the churchyard and fix the flower beds, or they're going to I mentioned this class that's doing a vacation Bible school. Boy, that builds so much spirit in that class. Them all to work together on this project. And they can do, we at our congregation, we have certain times when we have projects in the community. maybe working at a school or a park or somebody's house that needs repair that can't afford it, or doing something in the inner city, or somewhere that needs a project of that sort. It's not Bible teaching, but it's going out and serving people. And classes take on those different projects and work together. We have Edmond has a 4th of July celebration, and every year we man the watermelon table. And our people are there, and they've got a little sign on them, their name tag and where they're from, Memorial Lord Church of Christ, and they provide the watermelons. We serve the watermelons. Well, that's a good class project, and it's also gets the church a little publicity and things like that. So doing things in the class that allow them to work together as a group, I think can be can bond them and make them more likely to be regular in attendance. Taking care of each other. Somebody's sick, that they provide the food through the class. Somebody's in the hospital, they take care of that. Somebody's got a new baby coming while they have a shower or whatever, but they do some things for each other. And I think that's good for class bonding, especially young married couple.
We kind of got hit a few weeks ago with something hard that really affected the whole class. One of the attendees of the class, the police came and picked him up and took him to Muskogee, and he's been in jail for the last 6 months. They said he did something 2 years ago. And so he was guilty, and he slit somebody's throat, and the guy didn't die. But so I didn't know what should we do, and so all we just signed a card, and everybody mailed this card to him.
Well,
that's not saying we think you're innocent or guilty. We just.
Well,
I think that does. I think that builds.
Having a letter writing campaign. Let them write letters. Rotate in writing letters to him and things like. Sure, encourage him. That's very good. You may want to have smaller groups. If you got how many in the class? You
30 or so. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe you have two. You divide into 2 groups, and once a month after church on Sunday night, while these groups meet in somebody's house or whatever, and have a little fellowship and do something together like that can be helpful. Building class spirit is a very important thing to do, and it's interesting how it develops. We had a young couple that had a baby and was stricken with some kind of terrible thing, and they were in the hospital probably for 6 weeks, and she finally died. And that was tough on the class, and certainly tough on the young family, but the class really rallied to help them, and it was a positive, had positive results, even though it was a very difficult situation. So doing things that help them to work together, support each other, develop friendships, things like that, I think can be very helpful. Someone else a question or thought?
I have a question.
Okay.
Considering the way the churches were involved in serving God in the 1st century, and at that particular time, I'm assuming that they would have Rome was as modern as any. In that time, it was a very modern country or power. That everything was up to date. I guess what I'm trying to say is that at that particular time, the only thing from then till now has changed is just technology. But behavior patterns have not changed.
Yes.
Man is still confined to sin, as they were then, as they are today, and as they will be before the Lord comes. But now, these kind of practices that we observe in churches today, churches manipulating practices to suit the people, and I think this may sort of tie in with this postmodernistic view. But how long do we do this? How long do we keep pressing people into stronger spiritualism if they are constantly being diverted? And I'm not saying that it wasn't the norm even in the first century, but nowadays it's all about attracting people for the wrong reasons or using wrong methods of attracting them to the Lord. See, I don't know, I often have difficulty with that. You know, when you're using a kind of a program to attract people instead of Jesus Christ.
Well, what we know about the early church is they had very strong bonds with each other. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' teaching. But they also continued in fellowship and in prayer. And so the idea of doing things together, spiritual things together, doing things to help people become assimilated into a class or into a church, I think is certainly in harmony with Scripture. And while they had, you know, we're dealing with people who live more scattered, you know, in a larger geographic area and automobiles and all those things, and so we can't exactly just recreate the same home situation that where they were all kind of living in a cluster in a village, you know. So we have to do some things to help that to happen. I appreciate your comment about not using the wrong things to attract people. I think sometimes you can do that in ways that the net result is it's pretty shallow and doesn't have the impact it ought to. On the other hand, we can do things to fill people's needs. If the community needs teaching about family life, we certainly can teach them what the Bible says about family life, provide that service for them, and at the same time be teaching them the Bible. You know, I think that's a good thing to do. One of the interesting things that I think works really well is to involve non-members in things the church is doing as a serving method. If you have a benevolent program, let some non-members who are friends of members help in distributing the food. You know, that connects them with the members. It connects them with doing something good and kind of provides a breakthrough sometimes. If you have a program of sharing food to people who need food, or you have a program of doing certain kinds of service to the youth of your congregation, let them be involved in that. Is a way of getting them acquainted with the church and acquainted with the people and acquainted with the concept of service, and that can be helpful in getting them to the point where they're ready to be taught more about the Scriptures.
I think there's sometimes some things that we use are better than what worked before. And that's one of the things he said. There's a lot of things. My son, a few weeks ago, he's 9 years old, and he said a word that I don't like him saying. He heard at school, and it was the OMG. I like that, you know, that he hears it all day long at school. And so he came home and he said it one day, and I took him out we have a swimming pool, and took him out to the little above ground swimming pool, and I was showing him how you clean out the pool with the net, and I said every day, and I gave the illustration, you got to clean those things out of your mind and not say it. And so now every day I tell him, you know, how's that pool? Is it clean? You know, and he he gets it, he understands it.
Sure.
And I think sometimes we have to go over here and say, what route are we gonna get them to understand this?
Yeah.
Because there's some routes that aren't working. Is that what you're kind of, it's still the same message, but it's maybe a different route?
Yeah, I think
he was coming from another point of view,
Yeah.
where people are not using the message, instead they're using gimmicks and tricks to get people.
Right.
Oh, I see what
Yeah,
you're saying,
yeah.
okay.
Then also, not so long ago, we had a brother, I would assume, he has this program, for instance, in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
His goal and objective is to teach people English
Yes.
and try to get the gospel. He's been there for 30 years, and I think he's at just about under 10 baptism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why does one think that teaching, that people from other countries want to learn English? You see, there's this pretense that is going around that, when the moment you start teaching people about English, they assume that people want to learn English in other parts of the world. It's a way to try to get the gospel through to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that is just one issue that I'm sort of dealing with apart from others.
I think that method has some possibilities. I mean, it is true that people all over the world want to learn English. I mean, I've been to Poland and taught them using that method. And what you do is if you're teaching them English, see, these are people typically who know some English but need practice in speaking with somebody who is an English-speaking person. And so what you do is you say, okay, we're going to let you practice English, but we're going to do it by reading the Bible.
Yep.
And so we read the Bible together, and eventually many of them decide, well, this is pretty interesting. I want to know more about the Bible. But you've used the Bible as a textbook, as a means of studying English, and they learn. I mean, you don't deceive them. You do teach them something about English, but you do it in a way that interests them in knowing more about the Bible. I think that can be effective.
Yeah, or which would be better? Like the postmodernists was, like Alchop was talking about. You go to the country and study Japanese, for instance, and then try to reach the people. Wouldn't that be more effective? Because you're really doing what the Lord has asked you to do. You're giving them the gospel. You're giving them Christ who can save them in their very own language. See?
Well, I think the answer of those who are using this method would be that there are already people there preaching in Japanese.
Well, that's good if they are.
And if they, and they are trying to get them to come, but these people haven't come. And so a way of making the initial contact through teaching English gives them a different. See, the question is, what is the point of engagement? Where do you engage them? If you can engage them in Japanese instead of the Bible, great. But if you can't engage them in that way, then let's find another way to engage them. Let's engage them by using their interest in learning English as a way of getting them started, and then in the process we can move them through to know more about the Bible.
100
Is
years
that kind
ago.
of the way VBS was originally set up to be, where you engaged them by them wanting their kids to come and read
VBS,
song,
yeah.
and then you use that to reach the parents.
100 years ago, they had that book, I think it's called The Primer, remember that? And it had the alphabet, and every, like A was all scriptures inspired by God.
Sure, yeah.
And they had, each letter was training them.
That's right, and it was more than 100 years ago probably.
Oh, it was?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your point that we don't want to use methods that are diversions, methods that are gimmicks. But I do think that there are some ways of for example, in our youth program, we want our young people to bring their friends after school to our building and engage in some social activities with them. It gets them in our building, it gets them acquainted with our youth ministry. We think that does some good. But they come and they play, they don't play spiritual games, they come and they play, some kind of game, but in the process, he gives us an opening to begin to work with that person spiritually, and we have reached, quite a few people, young people in that way. So it's a part of knowing, finding the ways to reach out, I think, that can get you to your ultimate goal. Sometimes you invest so much in the method that you're wasting your time, and that's your point. I think that's right. So you have to be sure that it's going to be effective. Well, we've about run our course here today. Remember that tomorrow we will start with your sermons. We'll have each of you preach the sermon. We'll spend a few minutes critiquing it. Be sure you have a copy of the outline from me while you're speaking, while you're delivering it. That should take us probably from 2 o'clock to 3:30 or something like that. Then we'll have the test from 3:30 to 4.
Is it pretty hard?
Very hard.
Okay.
Oh, it's not too hard. I will ask you things, it's not going to be, no great surprise. I'm not asking you tomorrow to I'm not at the take-home test has on it taking a passage of scripture and preparing sermon outlines. That's on the take-home test. And so that's what you do after you go home. Tomorrow we'll deal more with some things about, if you'll look over the objectives of this class on the syllabus, that's pretty well going to tell you. There's one on there about information from Craddock and Lowry and whatever that we skipped, so you can scratch that one off. We didn't do that. I just said let's spend time on that. But you should know, you wrote your papers on Altrock. There's going to be a question about that. There's going to be a question about some of, we talked about inductive preaching, so you ought to expect something about that. We've talked about supporting material the other day. I'll ask you to some things about supporting material, and we'll have something from today's lesson. If I were you, I'd be prepared to draw that chart. Just a hint,
Okay.
I'd be prepared to draw that chart and maybe discuss some things about it. So, it's none of the questions are going to be surprising. You're going to know pretty well what we've talked about. Motivation we talked about today. You'll know something about that. Okay. Well, we will see you tomorrow at 2. We'll go till about 4:30 tomorrow, and then that will conclude.
Hope we don't ask you too many hard questions.
No, it's all right. No problem.